in the House, and control of the Senate hangs in the balance to be decided by another very unusual event: 2 runoff elections for Senate seats on this very same day in this very same state, Georgia, at the beginning of January. So there's a huge amount to talk about here. Luckily, we have an outstanding panel to look at these issues and shed some light both on why we are where we are and what it all means going forward. Our panelists today are Ojars Eriks Kalnins, Deputy Chairman of the Saima Foreign Affairs Committee, former Latvian ambassador to the United States, and someone with a lot of experience with Washington, even before that, because he lobbied Congress for the American Latvian Association in the 1980s. Hello, Ojars.
Greetings.
Daunis Auers is Associate Professor for Political Science at the University of Latvia, and his particular area of expertise is elections. Hello, Daunis. Martins Hiršs is a visiting lecturer at the Riga Graduate School of Law and a prominent expert on international affairs here in Latvia. Hello, Martins.
Hey, good evening.
And last, but certainly not least, we are very lucky to have on this panel Lolita Cigane. She is the only one of us who has actually been in the United States for the elections, and not just as a tourist. Since the end of September, Lolita has been working in Washington as an election observer for the OSCE. That gives her a unique perspective on these elections, and because of that, I think I'll start this discussion by turning to Lolita. But before I do that, I just want to make 2 points. First of all, this discussion will be recorded, just so everybody knows. And the second thing, we'll have time for questions at the end, but please don't hesitate to write your questions now. You can do that by going down on your Zoom screen to the chat button, pressing on that and writing in your questions. I'll follow along and we'll try to address as many of these questions as possible to our panelists during the course of the discussion. But now, Lolita, you were there. Tell us, what was it like? What were your main conclusions, and what were your most vivid impressions of these elections?
Yes, good morning from DC. It's actually 9 o'clock in DC, so we are starting another day, and just not to be too long, because obviously you are all following the media, and if anything, I think that the US election is probably the best reported and best analyzed in the whole world. So there is lots and lots of information available as regards to what is happening here. So the impression that I would like to share with you is the impression of my past to my working place. I'm working in the Reagan building, which is situated on Pennsylvania Avenue between the White House and Congress. And just 1 block away, there is the Trump Hotel, which has been very empty over the whole time I've been working here. And the very visible sign of the fact that actually the election day and the days following the election day and night have not really resolved much, as Pauls already pointed out, is the fact that the center of DC still remains boarded up. Businesses started having plywood walls going up to protect and cover their windows over the weekend before the election day, and they haven't removed them. Although on Saturday, when the victory of President-elect Biden was announced, the center of DC was full of people who were celebrating, also including close to the White House. And we were expecting that the city would return to what it normally is. It still remains boarded up. And it means that the situation hasn't been resolved. And obviously there is some expectation that there might be some tensions. And this is, of course, connected to the fact that it is still uncertain how the transfer of power will happen. There is a high level of litigation and court cases going on, and the whole country is in the process of waiting. And of course, if we are looking at the general information space, it is extremely divided. in the so-called liberal or more centrist media, there is a narrative that there is a clear winner, whereas in the conservative information space, there are still a lot of allegations about the election fraud, about uncertain outcome, and claims of President Trump that he probably won this election. So it is an extremely divided country and a lot of uncertainty at this point in time.
I just wanted to ask you, has the OSCE come out with a formal evaluation of the election? Was there a press conference where they said that it was free and fair, or what was the OSCE conclusion about the election?
Yes, indeed. We published our preliminary statement the next day after election on Wednesday. There was a press conference and a long statement that was issued. And answering the main question whether there was systematic election fraud and manipulation, we of course answered that we didn't see any of that. In general, the election administration worked professionally, processed ballots efficiently, and the only thing that we just have to remember that this country is huge. Every state has their own election system in accordance to which they run this election. There are about 10,000 different jurisdictions involved in this election, and many of them process ballots in accordance to their internal rules. For that reason, it takes a very long time to make sure that ballots are counted. But in general, given the magnitude and the amount of people who are involved in the administration of this election, to have a systematic fraud scheme implemented in this election, there should have been a massive conspiracy, which we didn't see. So that was our main conclusion.
Okay, thanks, Lolita. You had a very privileged perspective on everything that was going on, but as you said, I think everybody's following closely, especially the rest of our panelists, for whom this is their profession to know what's going on in politics and in international affairs. I'm going to ask Ojars, as somebody who's been following US politics closely now for 40 years, what are your main takeaways from this election?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's been a very unique election. I still remember Kennedy and Nixon back in the 60s. I go back that far. So, but it's unique not only because of Donald Trump, but also the way that it was handled. This is the first time they've had this kind of mail-in balloting, the voting starting 2 weeks ahead of time. I think that changed the whole pattern of how people vote. As you mentioned, the turnout was really huge. To me, there were a couple of surprises, maybe Georgia and Florida for different reasons. But I think the most interesting thing for me, the result is that it turns out that Republican politicians did much better than Donald Trump himself. And the indication is that a lot of people, Republicans, continued to vote for their senators, for their congressmen, but they didn't vote for Donald Trump. And so in some of the states like Pennsylvania and elsewhere, Trump got a lower vote, but their local politicians came in. And for me, the biggest surprise came after the election at the press conference at Four Seasons Total Landscaping, because I thought for a moment that Borat had come in to choreograph the event. So I'll just say this, that I think all of us who follow US politics know that the last 4 years with Donald Trump as president has been full of almost weekly surprises. And so it's no surprise that things continue to happen in unprecedented ways. And it's going to be interesting to see how it's handled. For me, the most interesting period now, even after the results are in and certified, and if indeed Biden is president, it's what happens between now and January 20th, and to see how Donald Trump uses his executive powers to make some last minute changes in the government and the secretaries and so on. So I think that's going to be very interesting to follow.
We'll talk about that a little bit later, but I think this first round, let's try to suss out what the most important conclusions we get from the from the result of the elections. Daunis, as an elections expert, what are your main points that you see coming out of these results?
Well, Paul, in your opening words, you said that this election wasn't normal. And my concern is that it is the new normal, not just in America, but all across the world, and especially in Europe. This is the way in which politics is increasingly being played out. And as a result, I found the whole election experience very, very depressing. I mean, it was a car crash of an election. But I mean, the similarities with recent British elections, with the Brexit vote, with votes we've had in Italy recently, are quite striking. And what we're seeing, I think, at the moment in this at the end of the second decade of the 21st century, is a culmination of a series of long-term trends. And I think the most important one I would emphasize at the moment is this rising distrust towards politicians and a de-alignment of political parties, which we see in all the democracies at the moment. And one of the results of this rising distrust is that party loyalties disappear and new types of politicians appear. Now, in Europe, that typically means new parties because of the proportional representation system we have. Because of the big tent structure of American politics, it means new politicians taking over parties. And we have Donald Trump on one side, and let's not forget that Bernie Sanders ran Joe Biden very close earlier this year, and that Bernie sits in Congress as an independent, not as a Democrat. So he's also a sort of outsider coming in. And one of the results of this polarization as well, of this distrust that people have towards politicians, is that it's rarer and rarer, and forgive me, Ojars and Lolita, I'm not talking about you, I promise I'm not, but it's rarer and rarer for normal people to go into politics, right? We're seeing sort of the fringes take over the political system because of the hatred that much of the public have towards politicians, and then social media as an opportunity to express this hatred. We see salary stagnation in many places because politicians are terrified of increasing their own salaries or their own benefits. And it takes a pretty brave person to go into politics these days. So increasingly, we're getting these more and more outlandish figures, Matteo Salvini in Italy, Boris Johnson, bless him, in the United Kingdom, and to a certain extent, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, and other sort of this caliber of politician coming into national politics. And as a result, I mean, I don't think this election and the nature of the election, the polarization, the distrust on both sides, the not giving consent to the result of the election, I don't think this is anything new. I mean, look at Brexit in the UK. You have half of the population not respecting the result of a referendum because it didn't go their way. And many of us might have a great deal of sympathy for this point of view, but it's still not giving consent to a major decision, that was given by the people. So just to sum up then, I don't see this election campaign, I don't necessarily see this result as a one-off. I think it's going to continue. And indeed, it may well continue in this very form. This morning, I was reading an interview with Joe Biden's sister, who's a sort of long-term advisor of his, who said, "Oh no, Joe's not going to be leaving after 4 years. He's in it for the 2 terms." And I suspect that Donald, or at least somebody with the surname Trump, may well be competing on the Republican ballot in 4 years' time. So crikey, I mean, we could go through this whole thing again in 4 years' time. This, just to sum up, Paul, I don't think this is not normal. I think this could well be our new normal for the foreseeable future.
Not a very encouraging analysis from Daunis. That may be typical British black pessimism. Americans tend to be more optimistic about the future. But I'll turn to Martins now. Martins is an international affairs expert. How do you see this, looking at it from the international ramifications of the elections? What are your main conclusions?
I think
Well,
it's important. Oh, two
No,
different
I would-
languages.
Martin Hiršs.
So the main thing, so Trump disputing election results is giving bullets to Russia, to China, and every other critic of U.S. democracy. So that's the biggest issue. So already Russia and China has given out some pretty nasty statements about what's happening in the United States. So U.S. President is essentially kind of giving ammunition to its enemies. But what I wanted to comment about, so I also researched disinformation in Latvia and elsewhere. And my conclusion of this election is that we can see the power of disinformation. Trump essentially made up stuff. There is no evidence at this point. He hasn't given any evidence that there has been any major large-scale election fraud, but we're talking about this. Media is talking about this. We should be talking about it about something totally different, how Trump and Republicans are doing something unique for the first time in actually forever in US history. There's a president who is not conceding the election. And Biden has won by at least 5 million, approximately 5 million votes. He has taken these Pennsylvania, Michigan. He has also taken most likely Arizona and Georgia, not by hundreds, but by at least 10,000 votes. So Biden has clearly won. And just the fact that Trump, who has lied consistently throughout his presidency, even before presidency, he has talked about, Barack Obama being born in Kenya, COVID being made up, and other nonsense. Just we can see after this election the power of disinformation. And also in Latvia, we see not only, so we were kind of used to talking about Russian disinformation coming and influencing our country over the last 9 months. A lot of these common nonsense we see on Facebook and elsewhere is not coming from Russia. It's coming from US. It's coming from US president. And that's a big problem that basically 21st century, that we have a US president simply lying, making up stuff. Because these grandiose claims he's making should have grandiose evidence, but he hasn't given anything. We're still talking about it. We're debating this here and elsewhere. That's kind of the biggest, my takeaway, the power of lies in politics. Second thing is about Republican Party. Republican Party had a chance to condemn this, stick to democratic values. At the moment, Republicans are sticking with Trump still. And that's also a big problem that one of two parties in the strongest country in the world is sliding towards, well, I would like even to say kind of authoritarianism. Is what Trump is doing. It's not democracy. It's something different, something similar to Poland, something similar to Hungary. And that's a very worrying trend. I'm probably going to take the most kind of critical and more cynical perspective into discussion. But what we see in US is very worrying, and it is not normal. It is extreme. We should call it extreme, the actions of Donald Trump.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Ojars has a follow-up.
Just 2 quick comments. I think one thing we didn't mention is the polarization of US society. That's very clear across the board. But the other role, both Daunis and Martins mentioned the media. And I think the media played a very outsized role in this, both the mainstream media, because you have Fox News basically campaigning for the president and CNN pretty much taking the opposite position. So that the mainstream media were very active, not just reporting the news, but really promoting it. And then there's the social media aspect of it. And you mentioned hatred toward politicians. I have not seen this kind of hatred toward journalists and toward the media in any previous election. And even now in the aftermath, in the vote counts, you see a lot of people blaming the media for declaring the winner and so on. So there's a third party in this that's playing a bigger and bigger role. And I think that was something that Ojars Eriks started when he founded Fox News. I think when he said that at some point the national parties, the conventions will not determine policy. It will be news stations like Fox News who will shape who the next president will be.
My question now for all of you, I mean, everybody has pointed to the risks of this transition period. Lolita mentioned the plywood still being on the, covering the windows of the stores in the center of Washington. Ojars mentioned the changes in the executive branch. How big a risk is this? I mean, if you read media in the United States, some people are raising the alarm that Trump might actually try to wrangle the process so that Biden simply cannot give the oath of office on the January 20th. Do you think that's a real risk? I'll start with Lolita again. She's on the spot there. I mean, how are people in Washington talking about this?
In general, I think it is a very big risk because all of us have pointed out that the polarization in the society is very high. And in general, my feeling is that people stopped listening to the views that differ from their own some time ago. Basically, all the media space, they really live in separate bubbles. So when CNN talks, it talks to CNN. When Fox talks, it only talks to Fox. So in general, something like a graceful concession from someone who lost the election would be very, very important. For this election, even more important from any of the previous. Because as we were pointing out, it was still 72 million people voted for Trump. They still think that he was a good candidate. They probably are critical about some of his personal characteristics, but in general, they believe that his vision for where this country should be taken was right, and they subscribe to it. So to heal this divide, you would need someone who would really calm down the tensions and would ask those who voted for Trump to respect the outcome. And this is what is not happening. And unfortunately, if we are examining the evidence that is being presented to the courts, it is mostly trivial, and many of those court cases have already been dismissed because the courts have an obligation to examine evidence. It's not like Fox News, who can just have a paper waved in the screen and then believe that there is evidence. When courts start examining this evidence, they mostly conclude that there is not enough grounds to in any way actually accept this as an evidence that there might be manipulation going on. So basically, by telling that these elections were fraudulent and there was mass manipulation, President Trump makes his supporters believe that it is indeed true. And this is a big problem because even when the new president is sworn in, there will be a massive amount of people who will not believe that this was a legitimate process. And this will just foster further polarization. So I believe this is very serious. And I do not see that there is sufficient uniting information space where messages about the reconciliation can be passed.
Mm-hmm. Daunis, you had a pessimistic take on these elections. I'll try to get maybe at least not an optimistic, at least some sign of hope out of you. Biden has declared in his victory speech that he will be a healer, that he'll try to bring the nation together. Okay, I understand maybe you think that's not very likely, but if he were to try to do that, what would be the best way? Is there any path forward on this? Can he do that?
Well, I think it will be difficult because, I mean, just to continue on from what Lolita was saying, there was a poll released in, I guess, our time in the afternoon, but in the US this morning, a morning consult poll that shows that 70% of Republicans believe that the election wasn't fair. 70%. And I don't think that will be changed by any events we have coming up in the next week or any decisions made by lower standing courts. So this really is Joe's problem, that there will be a significant part of the American population, not a majority, but a significant part who don't believe him to be legitimate. And this is before he starts his presidential program. And there are some things which are quite fundamental to what he's proposed to do, like returning America to a Green Deal, which simply just goes against the very sort of ethos of many Republicans. And I think that, from the very first months when he starts issuing his first executive orders, when he starts making his first decisions, there'll be a very sharp Republican reaction against him. And, we have these echo chambers, as you said, Fox News, CNN, where people hear what they want to hear. Well, let's just wait until Donald Trump creates his own media, which is something which is being speculated on at the moment and makes a lot of sense. I mean, if we've had Trump Airlines, if we've had a Trump line of clothing, I mean, Morten Hansen, who is with us at the moment, he may well be wearing his Donald Trump tie that he's very proud of at the moment. I mean, why not have Trump TV? And we know that Fox News is the most profitable news channel in the USA. So there's lots of money to be made from polarizing news. And I think that it's very, very believable that this sort of media will develop. And then in addition to that, we have the continuing social media, again, where people have a sort of free-for-all. And I think it will be very, very difficult for Joe to bind America, especially with the pressure he'll be having from the left of his party, from AOC and Bernie Sanders and so on, to first of all appoint people representing this left wing of the party, and also to enact those kind of policies. And as I say, I mean, I think it's hard to imagine a political figure who is more capable of trying to unite Americans than Joe. I mean, he has that kind of personality, he has that kind of look to him, and he has, a 50-year history of crossing the aisle. But I think it will be very, very difficult for him to do so because of these structural reasons that I've mentioned. So I'm sorry, Paul, I find it hard to try to put a positive spin on
hard
this
to
one.
be optimistic.
Maybe you'll have better luck with Martins Hiršs.
Oh, okay, a question has come in, and actually it touches on something that you mentioned about the potential for Trump TV. I know that's something, there were reports that he was already planning to do that after the 2016 elections in the expectation that he wouldn't win. But we've seen an interesting, not a 180-degree shift, but we've seen a certain step to the side by Fox in the last weeks. Fox was the first to call Arizona, much to the disappointment and chagrin of the Trump campaign. Fox has cut away from certain Trump and Trump representative press conferences saying what they're saying. There's no proof of these allegations of fraud. Of course, there are the commentators who are very pro-Trump on Trump, but we see a more of a mixture of views. And Simon Boddy has asked, has Murdoch told Fox recently to change tack? I don't know. Does anyone here follow Fox that closely? Does anyone have an opinion about why they may be mixing their messages like this? Maybe Ojars has something to say.
I see the reports from time to time, but I think this potential of Trump starting his own television station is very real. And I think Fox may be recognizing it because for the last few years, they have been Trump television on their own. And if he's going to go off and start his own, they have to go through a transition to take on a new role. And so they're slightly abandoning Trump in preparation for that, but whether they can survive, because I think Trump, as soon as he has a stage and a microphone, he's going to command an awful lot of people, and anybody in his family or anybody who's connected to Trump is going to use that new platform. So I think Fox is reassessing what their future role is going to be. Okay.
Anyone else on the role of Fox in the future? Lolita, you follow this closely?
Yes, actually, just to test whether this might be true, because of course we hear it here as well, and there are many people who are probably the more radical supporters of the President Trump who are saying that they are becoming more and more disappointed with Fox. I would say that this definitely is not a trend that is very visible. Actually, just for this reason, I watched a few hours of Fox News yesterday, and the very same White House spokesperson who was cut during the press conference that you referred to, she was on Fox during the commentator's hour, and she very explicitly for a long time went on waving papers and telling to what extent they have evidence of fraud for these elections. So I do not think it's a major trend that would really be too telling. So probably in accordance to whoever is in the studio, they might shift from this staunch support, but in general, I do not see a trend there. But definitely there is part of Trump supporters who feel that they need something more radical. So the space, in my opinion, and in accordance to analysis of people who are knowledgeable, the space has opened. So one of the storylines is indeed that the President Trump might actually have his own television station.
Mm-hmm. Martin, all these arguments, you already mentioned that a lot of the disinformation that we see in Latvia is also coming from the United States. If these conflicts in the US between Trump and the Democrats and Biden become more intense, how do you see that playing out in the Latvian media space?
Latvian media space, well, in the world, one of the problems that's going to arise from this bipolar foreign, well, kind of rulership of the U.S. is that so we saw Trump. He tried to offset Obama's legacy in foreign policy, also on domestic issues. So most likely Biden, he's going to offset Trump's, and he has said he will offset Trump's legacy. He's going to start with a flurry of executive orders to offset what Trump has done on climate, on a couple other issues. So if you are a country that you can just wait for 4 years till another president comes in power and changes foreign policy towards your region quite drastically. So we are going to see definitely this kind of bipolar U.S. foreign policy between Democrats and Republicans further on as well, and that's probably not good for a kind of long-term planning and stability of the world. In terms of media in Latvia, well, and also elsewhere, so there are a lot of copycats who are also in Latvia who are trying to copy Trump's style, Trump's rhetoric, and this gives them very good argument. A president of the United States has said this. Even if it's nonsense, if it's complete lies, for a lot of people, just the fact that this is U.S. president telling these things gives them credibility. Because, well, why would he lie? He's the president of the U.S. He couldn't do these things. He couldn't say these things. But he has, and he does. And that's a big issue. In terms of Latvian media, so we also have these kind of stuff that happens in U.S. slowly, gradually trickles down to us. We also saw our populist party trying to use Trump-style rhetoric. Definitely we're going to see probably a tenth of someone sooner or later who's going to blatantly, well, we already had a prime minister candidate who tried to say that the elections are going to be stolen from him and so on. So we're going to see Trumpism more and more, because as we can see in the US, it works. Trump received more than 70 million votes. So this style of leadership in 21st century with social media, with the world how it is now, does work, which is regrettable, which is horrible, but it performs and delivers results for Trump and other populists, not only in US, also in Europe.
I wanted to, we've talked a lot about the polarization in US politics and the conflicts that causes. And nevertheless, if we look at the results of the election, the divide, while strong, is not completely unbridgeable. I mean, we see that Biden received more votes than Democratic candidates to the House of Representatives. The Democrats lost votes in the House of Representatives. So obviously there were people who were splitting their ballots on this. We see Biden flipping states. I mean, the states that gave Trump the election in 2016, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, especially Michigan, have gone for Biden. Possibly he'll win Georgia. Looks like he's going to win Arizona, which no Democrat has won in something like 30 years. So is it really so hopeless? I mean, we can see that that there are people who are in between, who are not sort of baked into one side or other. How do we interpret these as results? Is this something that we can work, that can be developed into a bridge between the two sides? Who wants to answer? Maybe Ojars has a.
Yeah, I suspect that many of those, especially Republicans, who ended up voting for Biden, were really voting against Trump. Mm-hmm. And the fact that they voted for their congressmen and senators showed that they're still loyal to the Republican Party. They're happy about the new Supreme Court justice. They're happy about the Republican policies. What they didn't like was Trump. And I think that was the part that switched over. That could be temporary, because Biden he's a contrast to Trump, but he's not a dynamic, charismatic person. So I think the anti-Trump vote was very strong here, but the party loyalty remains.
Mm-hmm. Lolita, you had something to add?
Yes, just one factor that we sometimes probably do not see so clearly when we observe the US election from outside is the sheer vibrancy and diversity of the society. In election management, in counting the votes, there were so many hundreds of thousands of people involved. There was a very vibrant civil society drives to have voters registered. Many NGOs involved themselves in information to voters, calling to vote. The donation levels of small individual donations below 200 US dollars per election were very, very high. So basically, this is a very vibrant society that follows the election, that discusses politics, and I think this is basically the potential to heal in terms of most people doing their job with the best of the intentions. This again probably tells us another story to what extent this general majoritarian election system, winner takes all system, is probably not really suited for this diversity and vibrancy of the society. And for that reason, somehow just talking about the broader picture that also Daunis talked about, those countries that have more proportional representation system where many more interests can be represented, and the country does not have to align with either or. Those are probably more suited to this vibrancy, social media bubbles, fragmentation of the society. And here I think that the strength of the American society really comes from this very high level civic engagement. And by far, we can definitely say that absolute majority of those people are well-wishing Americans who want the best of the best for their country. And these radicals who probably would be prepared to defend the vote with arms or guns in their hands, it's a very, very small fraction still.
Okay. Everybody who's listening, I encourage you to write some questions in the chat because we're coming up to the question part. I hope we'll have some questions at the end. I wanted to ask you all from the point of view of Latvia. Okay, let's assume Biden is inaugurated on January 20th, but we see a very powerful, large section of the US electorate who doesn't accept him as legitimate. We see Trump pouting and attacking the new administration. We expect Trump himself or somebody who he endorses as his representative running in 2024. What does that mean for international relations? What does that mean for Latvia's relation to the United States? Maybe I'll start with Ojars, since this is your job to think about these things.
Yeah, well, I think regardless of who is president, relations between the US and Latvia probably won't change. They haven't changed in 30 years. They've been pretty solid. And even under Trump, we had a lot of support despite what he may have said about NATO. I think the real change could be US relations with the European Union, because there we saw the Trump administration pretty much hostile to the EU and multinational involvement. And I think Biden has already announced that they're going to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, go back and talk to WTO. So I think the Democrats are more into multilateralism. And what would affect Latvia is simply the EU-US relationship. But otherwise, in direct terms, I don't see anything changing. NATO will continue. We still have the full support of the US on that.
But I guess my question was a little bit more in terms of the fact that we see a very unstable and potentially changeable political landscape in the United States, where, okay, Biden is president now until 24. but who knows what happens in 24? I mean, Trump is going to be working as hard as possible to get reelected or get Ivanka elected or whatever, right? I mean, does that kind of instability affect the way we look at these relations with the United States, both in Latvia and in the EU?
Just one quick comment. Foreign policy rarely has much of an impact on public opinion in the U.S. They don't follow these issues. So again, if we look at Latvia, very few Americans even know what the U.S. policy is in this region. But it would affect Biden's ability to negotiate, for example. And something else worth pointing out when we talk about Latvia, if Biden's president, next year EU will be looking at a new trade agreement with the United States. And who is going to head up the EU's delegation? It's Valdis Dombrovskis, our commissioner. And it's going to be quite a challenge for him because we recall that TTIP 4 years ago was not that popular. I think even Hillary Clinton was critical of it. Yet that's an issue that's going to come back. And it's going to be interesting to see what kind of popular support there is for new international initiatives on behalf of the new administration.
Daunis, how do you see a very divided and internally aggressive American polity? How does that affect Europe's relationship with the United States, Latvia's relationship with the United States?
Well, I think foreign policy is very much dominated by the executive, of course, and it looks like Joe is heading back to the pre-2016 foreign policy. So the British conservative newspapers this morning were celebrating the fact that apparently Joe's first call to a international leader was to Boris Johnson, something which 10 Downing Street was terrified about. They thought they might be at the bottom of the list because of certain things that Boris Johnson had written about Barack Obama, basically some racist comments he had put down on black and white before becoming prime minister. But the fact that Joe appears to have turned to Britain, first of all, seems to signal a return to politics as normal, the sort of Anglo-Saxon relationship, even with the British outside of Europe. And I think that will reflect the general turn to stability and predictability that we saw, for much of the 21st century. So I think with this executive control over foreign policy, we will probably see a fairly steady and predictable foreign policy in the European region. And I think Joe is quite a traditionalist. As I recall, and Ojars can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that during the Obama presidency, Joe was also given, let's say, the sort of European portfolio from the White House perspective, but Obama was more interested in Asia and forging new relationships elsewhere. And it was Joe's job to massage the Europeans. And I think that as a president, he's likely to continue massaging the Europeans.
Joe's been in Riga. He spoke here 4 years ago.
Yeah, had some critical comments to make as well about corruption, but we'll see how that goes in the future. Martin, are you as optimistic about a Biden presidency for Latvia?
Yes, definitely. Because if you look at Biden and Trump, Biden, in terms of a couple of foreign policy issues, is much more closer to Republicans than Donald Trump, who was a total outsider to foreign policy thought and ideas. His foreign policy ideas is something unique, and no previous president has thought that we should start trade wars, that U.S. should do as little as he thought in the international arena. In many aspects in international foreign policy, Biden is going to do quite well, even with Republican-controlled Senate. For example, U.S. Congress had to pass a resolution in 2017 that prohibited Donald Trump, US president, from ending sanctions towards Russia. So definitely there was a large this disconnection between the Congress and the US president, between how US foreign policy should be conducted. And there are many questions, as Daunis said. So yes, Joe Biden has been to this region. He was the face of Russia reset, and he has seen that resetting relations with Russia does not really work. I think he looks at Russia quite similar to Baltic states. Also, he's talked about increasing NATO presence in Central Eastern Europe, which is something that Latvia might be quite keen on to strengthen our security and cooperation with the US. So definitely, if you look at Biden, quite beneficial to our foreign security policy.
But isn't there a risk if the Republicans maintain or retain control of the Senate that they may, just out of spite, try to undermine the Biden foreign policy? And the Senate has a great deal of leverage on foreign policy. They have to ratify treaties. They co-determine various things like ambassadorships and so forth.
On trade agreements, maybe, but in general, if you look, as I said, so Donald Trump, he was an outlier. So no Republican thought what Donald Trump thought and said on foreign policy for the last 50, 60 years since the Second World War. So in that regard, I think Biden is going to get better along with Congress than on foreign policy than Trump did.
Okay. Some questions have come in. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you to everybody who's listening. The first one is from Morton Hansen. There are two upcoming elections in Georgia, or one, or however we count them. Will this be the mother of all election spending, and how will it go? Lolita, you were closest to Georgia of all of us. Are you following events there? Will the OSCE be observing?
Yes, there is going to be a runoff elections for 2 senatorial seats in Georgia, and in general, we have already seen high-level mobilization for those races. There is already intensive fundraising going on. And of course, what is very important to bear in mind is that these actually 2 seats will be indicative of where the Senate will stand. And I would just bridge to the previous question that we were discussing, whether the Senate, if it is a Republican-dominated Senate, again, will have that much impact on foreign policy. And I think that actually foreign policy might be one of the areas where the president-elect Biden might have more ability to actually shape the narrative himself. When we are looking at the domestic policy, the Republican-dominated Senate has been really a stumbling block in so many issues domestically that have really been necessary to be taken care of. For instance, in the elections 2016, we saw a very strong foreign meddling in terms of social media, and there was a visible lack of regulation in those fields. There were several proposals, even bipartisan proposals, to change laws and to also enact new laws in front of the Senate, but they were never passed. So basically, in terms of legislation, there was nothing that addressed the problems of 2016 foreign meddling in the elections. And this is just one example as to what extent the Republican-dominated Senate is a problem in terms of really being able to pass much needed legislation. And if anything, then the Senate leader, Mitch McConnell, has indicated that he himself believes much more in appointment of judges than in passing necessary laws. And for that reason, Georgia and its results in terms of runoff elections that will be held in the beginning of January is very, very important. Also indicative of potential of success or lack of success for the upcoming Biden administration.
Mm-hmm.
If I could add something here. I think if you saw Biden's remarks yesterday, he's being very careful not to antagonize the Republicans, not to antagonize Trump supporters. He's not even saying anything negative about Trump. And I think, he's got a history of bipartisanship. Whether he could renew that with some of his colleagues is a question. But right now, it's clear that he is trying to end the polarization, at least from his side. So that the hope is that the Republicans will be more amenable to working with him if he takes this approach.
Oh, we'll see. We can hope. We can certainly hope. I'm going to address this question to Daunis, as he is the one pointing to the rise of populists and their influence in the Western democracies. Simon Bodies asks, Trump will be facing many lawsuits from the day he leaves office on starting, as Simon writes, the 21st of January in 2021, because of that, aren't we overestimating his strength and power? Because, you know, he'll be in court and arraigned and accused and so forth.
Well, I mean, isn't it the case that, I mean, as a major businessman in New York, especially in the real estate sector, I mean, he's probably been permanently facing lawsuits since the 1980s. So I really don't think this would be anything particularly new to Donald Trump.
Oh, but he has, but those have not. Daunis, if I could just interrupt, those haven't been criminal lawsuits, and he now, at least from the press reports we're receiving, he could be subject to criminal lawsuits as well.
Well, I mean, I think that the American court system will see him, you know, tied up in these for quite some time. I don't think he'll be in court unless he absolutely has to be. So I don't know what kind of physical presence there will be. But I mean, this isn't going to undermine the support that many Republicans and, or let's say the Trump Republicans have for him. This will simply feed into the image of the swamp having its revenge on Donald Trump. In a sense, it could even be a source of power to him because it will maintain him in the media. He'll still be the top story in the news, even when Joe Biden is in the White House. But, you know, Donald Trump in court. I mean, I don't see, unless, of course, things go against Mr. Trump and he ends up, you know, in some way being found guilty. I don't see that this is really something which will distract or take away from Donald Trump's core popularity amongst his voters. I mean, 70 million people voted for the Donald Trump that we have in this election, having seen every side of him, and still 70 million people turned out and supported him. And I don't think he would lose a single supporter if he was to be found guilty in a criminal trial in Manhattan. I mean, he has that famous phrase that, you know, he could shoot somebody on, was it 4th Avenue or 5th Avenue, and people would still vote for him. And I think that's even more true today than it was 4 years ago when he said it.
If I could add, as a person who grew up in Boston, where there was a famous mayor, Curley, back in the beginning of the 20th century, who was elected, not mayor, but to another office. He was elected to office while he was in jail. So the tradition of voters supporting convicted politicians in America goes back a long way. And the final question from Raita Seglitis, how does President Biden start to begin repairing the U.S. international image, and what will it take to do that? And how far will he be prepared to go to make amends with China, with Europe, and U.S. neighbors, North and South, Canada and Mexico, I presume? Who has something to say about Biden as a repair of the U.S. image and his relations with China, which is a bit of a separate question, but also very important? Maybe
I have just two very short responses. Like, as I said before, first thing I think he would do is try to repair the relationship with the EU and have a very high-ranking meeting with the EU leaders to try to rebuild that. And second, remember, you will probably be replacing a lot of ambassadors who were appointed by Trump, who are political appointees, and they have also a direct impact because they've had a negative impact in some countries. So I think that's the beginning, and then maybe NATO after that. Again, that's working with European countries, but I think that's the first step. China is a whole other issue.
If you could just briefly say, how do you think Biden would handle China, and what does that mean for Latvia and the EU?
You know, it's hard to predict how he's going to handle China, because I think in the EU, nobody really knows how to handle China. That's one of the biggest challenges we have. I've got a NATO Parliamentary Assembly meeting next week online, and China is one of our big topics about how that impacts security policy. So for me, that's a little bit hard to predict which way he's going to go. And a lot of it depends on how China reacts. Also how Russia reacts, North Korea. How are these countries going to respond to a Biden presidency? Mm-hmm.
It's worth noting that I think every EU leader has now, with the possible exception of Slovenia, has now congratulated Biden on being elected. But as far as I know, neither China nor Russia has done that up until now. Martins, as you're focused on international politics, for Biden to repair relations with US allies and other countries, is it enough for him just not to be Trump, or does he have to do something more?
Well, the first thing is that if you don't pick fights, unnecessary fights with your closest allies, that's a good start. The next thing is if you consult with your allies, that's also a good start. On many occasions in international relations of Trump, he didn't consult with Europeans. When, for example, he announced he's going to pull out of Syria, nobody knew. In the case of North Korea, he made some announcements. Also, no close to US allies knew about them. They found out about them in media. And that's not how you conduct diplomacy with partners, with allies. And also, he's a multilateralist. He's going to work through international organizations with partners together. So US, with all its power, military might, cannot solve these complex geopolitical issues all alone. And that's a big, big upside for Europe. Europe is going to have a say at the table on all these issues, on Iran, for example, also Russia, and also a couple of other issues that are on the table at the moment. It's not going to be, I don't know, European countries talking with Russia on Ukraine, with US playing a second role, maybe not even joining the meetings. US is going to play active leadership, which is also quite important, as well, regrettably, Europeans on their own, not that united without US helping and guiding us in certain directions. So that's an upside for us, US leadership and consulting with partners, not just ordering around allies.
Okay, we're coming to the end of our hour, and I just want a brief tour de table, as they say, about one question, because we've been talking about a Biden presidency as pretty much a given, and the voting seems to indicate that. And nevertheless, there are about 10 weeks left until January 20th. How nervous are you, each of you, about those 10 weeks, about Trump in office, having lost? Do you see any particular risks? I'll start with Ojars.
Yeah, I think there are two. One is what we're seeing right now is there's always been a transition period between the incoming president and the outgoing one. And as it looks right now, Trump's people are refusing to even talk to Biden's people. If that continues until January, that puts the US in a very insecure position. Some of the experts have pointed out that 9/11 took place a year after the Gore-Bush election, when there was also a delay in transferring all this classified information. So I think that period is going to be very vulnerable for the US, especially if there's no communication between the two. And then, as I pointed out before, is what kind of executive orders can Trump still pass without congressional approval? He's got a month and a half. How many personnel changes can he make in the ministry? We heard about the Pentagon. And so one thing that Trump has been very good at is breaking precedent and exploring the sort of the loopholes in the law wherever he could. And I think that's going to be a challenge, because especially if he's frustrated and he knows he's leaving, he could try to, burn the house down behind him as he goes out.
Daunis, the British burned the White House down in 1814, I believe. Will Trump follow in their footsteps?
Well, I think Ojars is absolutely right in talking about the legislative side, but just as important as the legislative is the spirit of the rule of law and these unwritten traditions that we have in democracies about the way in which power is passed on. And that's what I would be looking out for. I mean, I would like to think that on the 21st of January next year, Mr. Trump will greet Mr. Biden at the White House, be escorted to the helicopter and leave gracefully, because these symbolic transfers of power are very, very important today. I mean, we were talking about how to sort of dampen down the flames of emotion sweeping through America. A visible, smooth transfer of power showing that this is business as usual would, go a long way to ensuring a peaceful few years for America.
Okay, Martins, what are you?
Well, the biggest problem is that all the authoritarians are looking at this and they're happy with Trump saying crazy things and not accepting results and whatever he's going to do in the next 2 months. Probably going to give a lot of bullets for propaganda of Russia, China, and they're going to be able to tell to their citizens, look at US, what is this? What is happening? So US image, US well, kind of influence and sway, US soft power is going to be diminished. Most likely, I don't see a possibility where Trump's actions kind of play out good for US soft power and standing internationally.
Okay, and Lolita, we started with you, and I want to end with you. When do you see the plywood boards coming down off the windows of the shops in central Washington?
Actually, that's yeah, symbolically, and it is a good question. And actually, I expect that they just might stay up there up until 20th of January. Because in general, no one really expected this to be easy. But there are some very concrete constitutional timelines in accordance to which this process will happen. On 14th of December, the Electoral College has to meet. By then, the state election results have to be certified. All the litigation has to be cleared up. So far, we haven't seen any evidence that would suggest that any of the state results, as we've seen them reported, might be overturned due to this litigation. There are just small issues, small things, some of them really trivial. So this is a process of how the whole pace of events will be moving on. There is also a narrative that actually President Trump might be interested in conceding as late as possible because his campaign is actually continuing to fundraise. They are fundraising for litigation. There are a lot of people who are still doubtful whether all votes were counted correctly. So they continue donating towards these litigation processes. And part of those donations actually are going towards covering the debts for official Trump campaign. And in that respect, this can be seen as an entrepreneurial activity, basically to fundraise, to continue fundraising because the system just permits that. But eventually, there will be a substantial difference between the votes that both candidates received, a substantial difference in terms of electoral college votes. And I believe that the transfer of power will have to happen. It would have been good if it was peaceful, and as Daunis said, the signaling specifically for this divided society is very important. That most likely will not happen, but eventually the constitutionally mandated events will have to take place and will have to happen.
Okay, very good. Well, we are all looking forward to that, to a peaceful and swift and, well, professional transfer of power in the coming weeks and months. I think we've had an excellent discussion, very lively, lots of points of view, good insights into what's happening and what we can expect in the future. Thank you, Lolita from Washington. Thank you, Ojars. Thank you, Daunis. Thank you, Martins. Thank you to everybody who joined this discussion. And well, let's hope everything goes as calmly and peacefully as Lolita indicated in her closing words. Thank you very much for this discussion. See you sometime in the near future.
Thank you.